I've been planning on doing this video series for a while. I've been procrastinating and trying to figure out a way that I can actually manage to do them. I had a C-section back in 2011, almost 13 years ago, that left me permanently disabled, and I think it could have been avoided if the healthcare professionals actually listened to their patients. I'd thought I'd start out this video by reading the letter that I actually wrote to the doctors, or to the hospital, I guess, within a month or two after my last son was born 13 years ago. And I hope I don't mess it up too much, but I'm trying. To whom it may concern, I'm writing this letter in hopes that no one has to go through what I experienced in your hospital. Having a child is supposed to be a joyous occasion, and I had that taken from me. My main complaint was with the residents. There was absolutely no continuance of care with the patients. One resident would come into my room and tell me one thing. A few minutes later, another resident would come in and tell me something completely different. I tried to tell them what was going on multiple occasions, and every single occasion I would get cut off mid-sentence. I ended up having a complete bowel evisceration, all because they would not listen to what I had to say. Here's my story. I came to the hospital on March 23rd, 2011 for a planned C-section. It was scheduled to begin at 3:45 and was postponed by at least an hour. Every person I came in contact with, I had asked for some strong anti-nausea medication, as I had vomited all through my first C-section, like during and afterwards, and was terrified of the same thing happening again. I explained that I had to be given 3 different nausea medications. I think it was Zofran that actually worked in the end, because even my mother had had the same reaction to fentanyl, which is what they give you while you're having a C-section, while she was dying of cancer. And I knew Zofran because that was the only medication that also worked for her. The first nurse even put down fentanyl as an allergy on a red bracelet. Everyone told me to tell the anesthetologist, which I did. I do have a couple of complaints about the actual surgery. First was that a resident anesthetologist from another case came in twice, not just once, but twice, with other patients' chart to ask other patients' information while I'm in an actual surgery. That's a no-go for me. That shouldn't happen. I think once a doctor enters an operating room, it should be all about the patient that's in the room. I understand if it was an emergency, but this was about a patient's discharge, which I find unacceptable. Very minute in the scale of things. Another big complaint was that 2 doctors asked to be excused early. One was the doctor, I guess the resident that was helping on the C-section. She asked to leave early. She asked to be excused while my main OBGYN finished up the surgery so that she could go to her father's funeral. I really hope that is not the case, because if that was her father's funeral, she really shouldn't have been operating. And the other one was the nurse, the head nurse, asked to leave early because her daughter had a fever of, hold on, let me see, it should say here, I think it was like 103, 104, so she asked to leave early. So it was like almost like everybody was in a rush job to go home and not worry about me and the baby. That's how it felt to me. I don't know if that's the case, but I would assume everybody would feel the same in that kind of circumstance. Once the surgery was done, I was transferred to the recovery room. I was on the way there that the vomiting began. I was in an elevator, not a patient elevator. There was an elevator with all the other staff, all the other people in the hospital. There was no basin or anything given to me to vomit in. I had to use a hospital gown to catch my vomit while the horrified faces of the people in the elevator watched. It's, not the biggest situation, but, like something maybe hospitals could try and avoid a little bit. I went to recovery, continued vomiting, explained I had asked for strong nausea medication. That's when I told I was given gravel. And I said, I really don't think gravel is something strong. I had to stay in recovery for an extra hour and a half because they didn't send me to a room over shift change. Meanwhile, 2 friends of mine were upstairs, still in surgery, worried why I was taking so long. They asked after me 5 times before someone had the common sense to tell them that I was okay and I was in recovery. The whole trip to my room was nauseating, and I was nauseous and heaving, and this continued. About an hour after I was transferred to my room, the vomiting began, and I felt something pop. I immediately lay down. My husband ran to the nurse's station, and one of my best friends just kept hitting the nurse's button. The nurse came in and explained my wound looked fine on the outside because I hadn't popped any staples. Like I said, it popped on the inside. And as soon as they sat me up, it started bleeding. They came and I explained about the popping and the bleeding. Trying to talk to them was near impossible. They would cut me off mid-sentence, and when I was speaking, they would not even look at me or listen, and even started talking amongst themselves as though I was not speaking. At one point, one had told me the bleeding was normal and happened all the time, which this is my second C-section. I knew it wasn't. I explained the doctor had been there and said it wasn't normal. She shrugged and said that it is. They decided to do pressure bandages. They would press down on my wound with an IV bag and then tape it down. This was incredibly painful both while they were doing it and the whole time it was on. They did not believe every time they would take it off, the bleeding would start again. The whole time I kept telling them something is wrong. Something popped inside. All it's doing is causing more pain. One person who listened to me was a young nurse. I won't say her name. She was great and called the doctors every time my bandages were soaked with blood, like they'd soak completely through. She was the only one that reassured me everything was going to be okay. On the morning of the 24th, the residents came, so the next day, because I was bleeding again. She said there was an area where the wound was not sticking together, and a purplish bit was hanging out that she wanted to add a stitch. So she ended up removing 3 stitches and adding 2 more, even though the pop was inside, not on the outside, then placing another bandage. Early in the AM of the 25th, the nurse called the residents again, as the bleeding was still continuing even through the pressure bandages. A couple hours later, they showed up and said the bandages were not working and they were going to try and figure out what was going on. I remember momentarily relieved that this would finally be figured out and telling them that I was upset and they could not put on another pressure bandage. They said they didn't want to have to take me down to surgery, so the only other option was to take out the staples and check everything was okay with the wall below. She took out a couple staples and poked around with an instrument. At first they said that everything was fine. Then one of the residents, actually the 3rd-year resident, not the 1st-year one, said, "It's not the bowels." Then the room got tense. One said she removed all the staples. The other answered the bowels are exposed. And out my bowels came. Then the room went into a panic. I started screaming stop because she was trying to push my bowels back into my stomach, like with all her might. And I started screaming stop. And she started ripping IV bags over and pouring them over my stomach, but not stopping the pushing before that. Poured the IV fluid all over my belly and then covered me. And I think it was around then that she hit a panic button and said that they were getting a NOR ready to transfer me. I was freaking out, telling her that for 2 days I've told everyone who wouldn't listen that I felt and heard something pop inside, and that now, sorry, I gotta scroll down a little bit, I can't see all of this. Now lying here with my bowels literally hanging out of me like sausages, her response was that she tried to put them back in but stopped because I started screaming. I asked for my cell phone. I calmly called my husband and told him he needed to get to the hospital because I was going to surgery. I called a friend, my first son's godmother, who's working at the hospital next door, to come and watch my other son while I went in for surgery. And that my valuables were in the room, which they didn't seem to care about. So thankfully she showed up. I remember going in an elevator and people running off. The resident kept saying she was sorry she didn't listen. She went to the 5th floor and I remember hearing, "Is this the one? Where are we going to put her?" What are we waiting on? I was so mad and kept saying, I wish someone could have. I somehow deleted the second half of this video and wasn't able to merge them, so I'm going to redo the second half and try and turn them into one complete video. I'll start at the paragraph that I was speaking on last. I remember going into an elevator and people running out of the way. The resident kept saying she was sorry she didn't listen. We went to the 5th floor. I remember hearing, "Is this the one? Where are we going to put her? What are we waiting on?" I was so mad and I kept saying, I wish someone would have listened. And the resident kept apologizing. I kept asking to be put out. I was so scared and kept saying, I can't do this. I remember a lady asking me if I wanted another spinal. I said, are you kidding me? How are you going to do that with my bowels hanging out? Was my response. Well, the lady's face just hung open. Then a doctor came over and asked what had happened. I told her for 2 days I'd been saying I felt a pop and I began bleeding as soon as they sat me up after I felt the pop. She said this wouldn't have happened if I had done the first surgery with her, because she'd been the one who'd actually done my first C-section. I said, then they wanted me to sign a consent to do the surgery, I guess, to put my bowels back into me. I couldn't read, I couldn't see anything. They literally had to take a paper, put my hand on a paper above my head, and I just scribbled like that. I don't know what type of consent that is, but how is that authorizing anything? This still bothers me, because how can you ask anybody to consent to someone, anything? In the condition that I was in, it just didn't seem right. We went into the OR and I had to wiggle from my hospital bed to the operating table. I think this was one of the most terrifying things I've ever done. I kept visioning my guts falling out and hanging down to the floor and kept wondering how I was still alive. Then the anesthetologist guy asked about what I had eaten last. I'd had a muffin and a glass of apple juice about an hour earlier. I begged him to knock me out, and he said that they were waiting to fit me for a trach because they were worried about my muffin ending up in my lungs. I felt him pushing on my throat and thinking I was going to have a scar, and I was out. I woke up to my husband and remember being really thirsty. I woke up again because there was more bustle around me, and I was being told to breathe deeply, that every time I fell asleep my oxygen saturation level went low. Then I remember the nurses arguing with someone on the phone about where to put me. The floor I should go couldn't accommodate babies, so that left returning me to the baby unit that in my condition I really shouldn't be in. And when I went back to my room, my roommate said she was so scared because the way we were both yelling, screaming, and stop, and they wouldn't stop. Shortly after I got back to my room, a doctor came in and said she was a resident of, I believe it was anesthesiology. She said that the stitches didn't pop, that the wall holding the bowel had just collapsed. Then she said that they were going to keep me on a regular diet because that's what I'd been on before with no problem. My OBGYN came in shortly after that and said he had rushed in and was there while they were operating, that the stitches holding the fascia had burst, a complete opposite of what the other doctor just told me, that I was right, that they should have listened to me when I felt the pop, and that this is really rare and never happened to him. He said that I would have oxycodone every 4 hours and have morphine in between for pain. There was no infection in the wound, which was good. He said they used permanent stitches inside me to make sure it doesn't happen again. He said I would be on a liquid diet, again, opposite of what the other doctor said, until they heard signs my bowels were working, and had no clue why the resident would have said that I should have been on a normal diet. After he left, I buzzed the nurse to get a shot of morphine. She came in and said that the resident had canceled all my orders and did not know why. So I had to sit in pain for close to an hour after this major surgery. They had to find a doctor to rewrite the order. I asked him to call my OBGYN on my cell phone. When he did, I told him I'm done. I no longer want to have any of the residents treat me, that I cannot deal with any more of their BS. I woke to around 1 a.m. to my husband saying, please don't wake her. She finally fell asleep. It was the resident who had taken out the staples. First, she apologized for coming so late She had just gotten out of surgery and she was still in her surgery scrubs. She scooted my legs over on my bed and sat down, which I obviously didn't like. She said she wanted to apologize, that sometimes things like this happen. I told her I didn't like being woken up at 1 a.m. to hear an apology, that for 2 days she wouldn't listen, that she actually cut me off while I was talking on more than one occasion. 3 times I told her I did not want to have this discussion. Can you please leave? And she kept going on about how they know it's a problem, that they know that the continuing with the patient they start with, that there is no continuance of care, that it's a staffing problem. Maybe I could help figure out a way it won't happen again. I have told her if they are having staffing issues to have a staff meeting, that coming to wake me up to discuss it with me when I have asked her to leave is not right. She left saying sorry again. There were a few other things that came up around my discharge that I was not happy about. My son's jaundice test had to be repeated because it came back high. I asked 3 different nurses about the results of the second jaundice test, and all 3 told me that it did not need to be repeated. I was packed and ready to leave the hospital when the head nurse came in and said his jaundice test should have been repeated days ago. It came back high, and that normally they would not discharge us, but given the circumstances, she would discharge me as long as I agreed to push fluids, supplement with formula, and have the test repeated the next day. Also, apparently the pediatrician who was supposed to examine my son within 24 hours of his birth only filled out half the form. Another thing I thought I would mention is the medical bans. When I admitted they asked about allergies, I told them I was allergic to most raw foods. Every single tray I got had raw fruit on it. Also, I found an asthma puff from my bed a couple days after the second surgery. My nurse checked my chart and no one had written anything about it in my chart. I do know what this is about, and I will tell you about it when I finish reading the letter. I wrote most of this when I got home from the hospital and just today typed it up. I know that I probably included a lot of information that really isn't needed, but I wanted to give you a good idea of how hard this ordeal has been on me. And excuse any spelling or grammar errors as I have a baby in my lap and I'm typing with one hand. It is now 2 months later, and although I've been told there is no long-term consequences, I'm still not well. I'm unable to have a bowel movement without first using a suppository or an enema. I have spotting of brown, red, or pink or yellow discharge depending on the day. My stomach is numb from the belly button down and feels like a large bruise. When I walk or move, the jiggling causes pain. When I get backed up, I'm in extreme pain for a couple of days. There have already been a couple of occasions that I've contemplated calling 911. If that isn't enough, I've had 4 of the worst migraines I've ever had in my life. This is supposed to be a joyous occasion, and instead this is the experience I've had. I feel that a lot of this could have been avoided. I was fortunate enough to have home care that helped me for the first, I think it was 8 weeks. Then I will be alone with 2 kids under the age of 2. My OBGYN at that time said that we would wait till the 3-month mark before looking into seeing a specialist. I'm praying that I can return to normal soon. I'm hoping this letter can be reviewed. No one else has to go what I've gone through. I would like to have a reply letting me know that this has been received and made it into the appropriate hands. Yours truly, Zara. That was almost 13 years ago. It'll be 13 years next month. For 13 years I've lived with this. I don't go to the washroom like a normal person. That asthma puffer that they found in my bed, I recently found out what it was from my medical charts. I guess they had trouble keeping me breathing. I had to be intubated, I think 3 times, including a bedside intubation in recovery because I stopped breathing. And like while I was down there, my OBGYN was up with my husband, and I guess he was in shock as well because he just kept saying to him, "She's lucky to be alive, she's lucky to be alive," repeating the same thing over and over again. This is not what our healthcare is. To get me to have even the tiniest bowel movement after this ordeal and to leave the hospital, they had to use an enema. I had never had one before. I sat with that enema in for a good 2 hours, not knowing that it was supposed to come back out. And eventually a little bit came up, and enough that they could discharge me. 13 years later now, we do know there's definitely bowel endometriosis, there's gastroparesis, my bowels just don't work, dysgenic defecation, which basically means I don't have the muscles and the ability to push down like a normal person to have a bowel movement. This has severely affected my life. And I'm pretty sure everybody's heard a bit about endometriosis now. But the pain that I've lived it with, and that my kids have had to live with, watching me suffer with this, is not acceptable. If Canadians are leaving the country to go get surgery, because there's over a 5-year waiting list to have a surgery to try and fix your endometriosis, we need to do more in this country, because that's not acceptable. And now I'm hearing that patients who are leaving the country are also getting blacklisted, like patients like me who tried to file a lawsuit against a doctor who left me a shell of the person I once was. For me, the hardest part though is the mom guilt, not being able to do the things I want to do for my kids. It's really, really hard, but it's made them two of the most empathetic, more empathetic than a lot of adults that I know, empathetic and loving boys. I'm going to continue to share my stories because it's far, far from over. 13 years later and I'm still suffering. So please, thank you for watching. Please, if you can, share, get the word out there. People need to realize how easily this could become them. We both had good jobs. I worked in the hospital right next door to where this happened. We just bought our first house in downtown Toronto, and now we're struggling to try and survive on ODSP. And this isn't fair. Thank you very much for watching.